Okay. Now you have the file. You are seeing the file, isn't it? You can see the file.
Yes, yes, hocam. Yes, I see. No problem.
Okay, inflation, unemployment, and the Phillips curve. We are going to exercise and introduce how the Phillips curve affecting and changing the most of the belief in the economy. We will introduce you, and we will give you the application with the theoretical in presentations of the formula, and the graphical illustration will be introduced you for being able to understand the relationship between the unemployment and inflation, because it is believed that the inflation is the one of the important parameter which is affecting and reducing the unemployment. If the inflation is high, it is supposed that this will contributing in the short term, of course, contributing to reducing the unemployment. Unfortunately, we are not on this same belief. I don't support this belief because there are too many applications and there are too many studies on this subject. And partly it can be if this is applied to the whole economy, where there is only the production and the inputs produced and used in the internal market. But if it is imported some intermediate goods and services or using to produce some final goods, energy such as energy and some other materials which is used in the production operation process, unfortunately increasing much more than the expected contribution to the economy. From this point of view, therefore, inflation on the one side is contributing to enlarge and increase the resources in the production, so-called the producer side, but on the other side, it is accelerating the cost of the production because of this energy usage. Because, as you know, many countries importing currently the natural gas and some other energy usages, and most of the materials coming from the China and some other countries where they are producing cheaply, especially Canada, Ukraine. These are the most important destinations for exporting these products to the countries. Therefore, it is not very well adapted to the current situation. Let's go through the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is an economic theory that inflation and unemployment have a stable and inverse relationship. As I mentioned to you, as it is in suppose inflation shifted up, this will then reduce the unemployment rate. It is supposed regarding to the Phillips curve. We will, in short period of time, introduce you the graphical illustration on the Phillips curve, how it is affecting and changing the economy. And it is supposed that as much as the minimum wage becomes smaller, and lesser, this will then enlarge the employment. But let's see. Developed by the William Phillips, it claims that with economic growth comes inflation, which in turn should lead to more jobs and less unemployment. The original concept of the Phillips curve has been somewhat disproven due to the occurrence of stagflation in the 70s. When there were high levels of both inflation and unemployment, this was becoming to this subject. This was becoming to the discussion topic. The concept behind the Phillips curve states that change in unemployment within an economy has a predictable effect on price inflation. When inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation is this deficit as a downward sloping concave curve with inflation on the y-axis and unemployment on the x-axis. Increasing inflation decreases unemployment, it is supposed, and vice versa. When you are supposing you are increasing, let's say, unemployment, this has meant there is more and more downward sloping in the inflation. Alternatively, a focus on decreasing unemployment also increases inflation, and vice versa also, which means you are increasing the unemployment. This means you decrease the inflation. This is somehow represented on the graphical illustration as it is indicated here. This is here given the on the right side of the curve. We are observing the Phillips curve, which is not very curve linear drawn, but it is a linear curve illustrated. You have observed between the inflation and unemployment rate, there is a inverse relationship. As much as you are shifting the inflation, it is supposed that the output, or so-called the unemployment rate, will becomes output will increase and unemployment rate will reduce, or vice versa. When you shift the output to the lower level, this is supposed that inflation will become lower. The graphical illustration on the left side is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve that we are already exercised in our previous classes and lectures. As you see, in the short run, it is supposed that aggregate supply curve is shifted upward as much as you are shifting the price level, which is then increase the quantity, so-called the GDP or the output. And regarding to this increase, it is also expected that the aggregate demand will also shift to the upward. When we are looking to the long run Phillips curve, I have already explained you, this is only in the short run effective, but in the long run, it is supposed that the inflation or the rising the prices is not affecting and changing the, let's say, unemployment rate. This is because it is supposed that there is natural rate of unemployment, and this is then because as much as you are increasing the inflation or the price, general price level, this will not affecting the unemployment rate. And in the long run, it is supposed that the unemployment is become intact to the price changes, or to hiring or increasing the prices. When we are looking to the classical and Keynesian approach on this issue, the classical economists assume that all resources present in the economy were being used at capacity. However, this theory was a complete contradiction to the actual economy during the World Depression that started in 1930s, where unemployment was much or rampant and factories were not full loaded or idle. John Maynard Keynes, on the other side of the classical view, argued that the prices and the wages were sticky because of these long run effects, and in particular, they were inflexible downward due to the existence of the unions, because unions are insisting, as you know, we are talking about the labor unions, they are very resistant and very powerful at that time for not changing the prices and not affecting and changing the wages, because as much as you are downward your prices, it is supposed that this will then affect and change the output also. Therefore, this existence of the unions and the contracts between the employers and the employee, this is then causing this sticky wages and sticky prices in the economy, because it is not easily adapted to these price changes, as I mentioned, because of the unions, labor unions. In short run, aggregate supply curve, it is supposed is effective when the price changes is realized. It is supposed that the output is increased, but in the long run, as you are observing, the classical view is also supposed output is not effective as much as you are shifting the price level. The classical view also, as I mentioned to you, the long run is not effective. The classical economists believe that the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical line because of these price changes not effective in the long run, and the full employment levels of resources. This is because they think that in the long run, the economy will operate at the full employment level of resources, and this version of long run aggregate supply curve is shown below, as it is supposed that the year in the x-axis, as it is indicated, real GDP is the Y. F means Y output, and F is the full employment, indicates full employment has not becoming effective. The price changes is not affected from the price changes. And when we are looking to the comparison between the classical and the Keynesian, as you are observing, since the long run aggregate supply curve is not effective of the price changes, but the aggregate demand curve is affected and changed regarding to the long run. And when you are looking to the Keynesian approach, there is some short-run effects where the price is supposed to be fixed, stable. The long run and in the intermediate level, it is supposed these price changes will become effective to the aggregate supply, but then in the long run, it will become ineffective as it is in the classical view. This is then shown that the long run price changes or the inflation has no effect on the economy. Neither the employment nor the output is becoming affected from these price changes. And when we are looking to the factors which is affecting the long run aggregate supply curve in the long run especially, then we are understanding the available land and the raw materials, the quantity and the productivity of labor, which is becoming more effective for increasing the produced goods and services, and quantity and the productivity of capital. These are the most important factors which is affecting and changing the production. And the technology, the available technology, are all very important for increasing and enlarging the output, which affects the productivity. We have already introduced you in the former classes. I can put you to see the production function. If you suppose that y is the output, it will become then equal to the available technology is the function of the K, K and L, especially capital and labor, and also M and N, isn't it? But we are concentrating here when you are looking to this production function, where Y is the output, A is the available technology, and F represents the function of this capital, labor, natural resources, and human resources. As you are observing, this available technology is affecting the labor, affecting the capital directly, and changing the amount of the goods and services in the economy. Therefore, the price changes is becoming not effective in this issue. When we are looking to the classical view, as much as we are looking to the short run shifts to this aggregate supply curve, you are observing the output is shifted backward position because of these price changes. And when you are moving to the long run, in the short run aggregate supply curve, the aggregate demand curve is affected in this direction, where the short run aggregate supply curve is not changing, but the aggregate demand curve is shifted to the outward position as much as the prices increase. In the diagram, as I mentioned on the left, the short run aggregate supply has shifted to the left, and this could be caused by rising the oil prices or by rising any other product prices. It's supposed to be the oil, and this will then increasing the cost of the production. As you see, when the cost of production is increased, this will then reduce the output because of this increasing price. And in the diagram on the right, where we are indicating here the aggregate demand curve, we are shifted to the upward. And this is then represents the higher aggregate demand has led to a higher price level and the movement, as long as the short-run aggregate supply curve gives spaces. And the factors which is affecting the short-run aggregate supply curve, when we are mentioning, there is the price of the raw materials, such as oil, food, metals, and cost of labor, wages, taxes, and which is regulations also important in this direction, and the level of tax and the subsidies is coming to the issue, because when you reduce the tax level, this will reduce also the cost of the production, because they don't have to pay too much to the government, and this will then enlarge and increase the profit rate for the producers. And on the other side, when you are reducing the cost of the living for the consumers, they will enjoy to shop more, because this taxes become as a burden on the consumers, and this will then enlarge their shopping capacity. And from these directions, you are understanding, it is good to know the prices are not effective as much as indicated on the graphics. When we are looking to the Keynesian short run aggregate supply curve, as I mentioned to you, it is supposed in the short run is fixed somehow, the prices, and in the long run or intermediate period of time, this will then become some effective, but in the long run then will not become effective. Since the prices become fixed in the short run, then how it is going to be affect and change regarding to the Keynesian economy. And the aggregate demand curve, as you are observing between the output and the prices, there is inverse relationship, as we know from the former classes. And when we are looking to the long run aggregate supply curve for the Keynesian economics, we are understanding that the Keynesians believes the long run aggregate supply can be upwardly sloping and elastic, as it is indicated on the graph. It is a little bit elastic, and it goes from well, let's say horizontal line on the real GDP, and in the intermediate period of time, it will become effective from the price changes, and in the long run, it will become again ineffective for the price changes. They argue, the Keynesians argue that the economy can be below the full employment level even in the long run. For example, in recession, there is excess saving leading to a decline in aggregate demand. And Keynesians also believe wages and price can be sticky, as I mentioned to you, because of these unions, and therefore economies don't automatically return to full employment in the equilibrium, it is supposed. And when we are looking to the Phillips curve is related to the aggregate demand and aggregate supply on the curve and on the figure on the left side, the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply represented. We are understanding that there is an increase in demand supply and increase in the aggregate demand as it is indicated on the graph, where the long run aggregate supply is stay intact because of the price changes. If it is in the short run, it is becoming effective, but if it is in the long run, then it is not effective. But the aggregate demand curve is shifted to the upper level. And when this has happened, then it is supposed this will then cause the rising the general price level. And when the price level is shifted, then it is understandable that the inflation is realized. And results of this leaves output and unemployment at their natural rates because it will become ineffective for the long run. As I said to you, long run aggregate supply and the Phillips curve are not affected or are not becomes affected from these price changes. And on the graph, this is also illustrated. And expected inflation, when we are going to the expected inflation, which is also important issue in the economy, it is the measures how much people expect the overall price level to change in future. In the long run, expected inflation adjusts to changes in the actual inflation, and the central bank, so-called the FEDs, as you know, the Federal Reserve System, it has the ability to create unexpected inflation, exists only in the short run. As you are understanding, the FEDs has the parameters and the instruments for controlling and changing this inflation regarding to the policy or governmental applications. Once people anticipate inflation, the only way to get unemployment below the natural rate is for actual inflation to be above the anticipated rate. Let's look up the calculation, how it is going to be estimated. The unemployment rate is supposed to be the natural rate of unemployment will be subtracted from the actual inflation minus expected inflation. This equation relates the unemployment rate to the natural rate of unemployment, actual inflation, and expected inflation. When we are questioning what is the natural rate of unemployment, of course, we will introduce you in the following slide. The expected inflation shifted short-term Phillips curve, as it is indicated here. There is an expansionary policy moves the economy up along the short-run Phillips curve, and results of this, then we are understanding this short-run Phillips curve will becomes upward position, where the long-run expected inflation rises and the short-run Phillips curve shifts to the right. And as you are observing, again, the long-run Phillips curve is stay intact, is not changing, and the natural rate of unemployment is also affected and stay on the same line, but this will then shift only the short run Phillips curve where the high expected inflation is supposed to be realized. And shifts in the Phillips curve, the role of the supply shocks is becoming also important as you are understanding from the curves. This short run Phillips curve, which is affected from these expected inflations and the inflation rates, will also will cause a shifts because of shocks to the aggregate supply. Major adverse changes in the aggregate supply can worsen the short-run trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and adverse supply shock gives policymakers a less favorable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When we are shifting the Phillips curve, the role of the shock of the supply will be then an event directly alters the firm's cost, and as a result, the price change, which is going to be charged. This shift the economy aggregate supply curve, and as a result, there is a Phillips curve again affected. The natural rate of unemployment, which is supposed to be well known, narrow, the natural rate of unemployment is the unemployment that does not go away its own even in the long run. So it means that we have always some unemployment rate, even if it is supposed to be we have zero unemployment. This is not true because there is always some 5 to 6%, so-called to 4%, sometimes unemployment rate, which is always existing in the economy, is not going to be calculated, is not going to be estimated, because many of the people who are not working and who are not registered as unemployment is not going to be to the offices. And this is the reason that we are supposing always there is some unemployment rate. This is supposed to be the natural level of this unemployment. And as I mentioned to you, it is around 5%. And it is the amount of unemployment that the economy normally experiences. And when we are looking to the Phillips curve calculation of these, as you observe, the Q or P, as you know, is the inflation, and PE is the expected inflation, U is the unemployment, UN is the natural rate of unemployment rate, which is going to be calculated, and V or V is the supply shock, and B is the slope, which is the beta supply of the curve. And when we are looking at the equation, is suppose that the inflation is equal to expected inflation minus beta, so-called the slope of this curve. The differences between the unemployment, so-called the existing unemployment, and the natural rate of unemployment, the differences will give us the unemployment, the deviation of the unemployment from the natural rate of cyclical unemployment will then added, will then this equation added the supply shocks to give us the inflation rate. When we are looking on the curves, we are observing these adverse shocks or the supply shocks on the curves. It is indicated, as you see, when the adverse shifts on the aggregate curve is realized, it shifts the aggregate supply curve to the backward position. As you see, the prices increase, the rise of the prices realized, and this is then because of the aggregate supply curve is supposed to be shifted to the backyard or backward. And results of this is then lowering the output, or lowering output causing this rising the price level, because as you see, either the output is reduced and price shifted, and vice versa, the price is going up, and because the output is lower. And results of all this, then it is supposed on the Phillips curve will be an enlargement and shift to the outward to the from the origin. And this will giving the policymakers a less favorable trade-off between unemployment and inflation. As you see, this recessionary period and recession in the economy causing some unemployment and inflation. As you see, it shifts the curve to the higher level. What are the actual GDP and potential GDP from this point of view when we are questioning? Because we are understanding that this is also important to know for calculating this inflation and calculating the economical profitability of the production operation process. What are the actual and potential GDP, or real and potential? And economy's potential gross domestic production, or GDP, is it maximum, supposed to be, an ideal output while sustaining high employment level across all sectors and preserving goods price and currency stability. At the same time, a nation's measurable output at any time is represented by its actual GDP. If you have any question, you may ask me, Taptik. If not, then I will go. The potential
everything's
GDP.
okay.
Okay. Potential GDP refers to the maximum output an economy can produce using its existing economic resources. It represents an economy's long-run aggregate supply. At this level of output, the economy will fully utilize all its resources and work full employment. The potential output is an important indicator. It is useful for measuring how much an economy can produce goods and services. By comparing real GDP and potential output, you will know whether production can increase and how this will result in inflationary pressures and unemployment. As it is indicated on graph, we are representing here on the x-axis the GDP and on the y-axis the aggregate expenditure. We will calculate this aggregate expenditure models, but I will give you some more theoretical explanation and theoretical definitions, and of course graphical illustrations for being able to understand better. Then we will start to apply this on the let's say real life. As you see, we have the potential GDP here on the right side of the equilibrium. And what does it mean? What does mean? Here, real GDP, Y, so-called, is less than potential GDP. As you see, the potential GDP has meant you are in the full employment, you are using full capacity, and it is the economy's all expected realized capacity or production. But if the real GDP, so-called existing current year GDP, is below realized and the aggregate expenditure intersect this 45 degree, then this has meant you are below this potential and you need to enlarge it. Therefore, there is a surplus and this creates high inflation, it is supposed. When the GDP falls below the real GDP, this has meant we have a shortage and this creates output gap. Therefore, in better position, you have to enlarge a little bit more for reaching this potential, which is supposed to be enlarged and increased in this model is very much right side of the equilibrium. And when we are looking on the applied model, which we calculated, and I put here to show you a little bit more comprehensively, when real GDP, which means Y, is more than potential GDP, which is, there is a green dot here. As you see, this is the Y potential supposed to be. There is a surplus because the output is realized on the right side. And this has meant there is a surplus and this creates higher inflation. And when potential GDP falls below the real GDP, as it is indicated on the left side, this has meant there is a shortage and this creates output gap. We have to shift the output a little bit higher for shifting and enlarging our expected potential for reaching to our equilibrium position, so-called. Here the numbers is not important because I just show you how it is going to be calculated. In future classes, maybe after 1 or 2 weeks later, I will give you one example with these numbers, then you will understand better how this is going to be. And here it is given the inflationary gap on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve, as it is supposed to be the potential output is realized on the left side of this equilibrium, and this has meant there is an inflationary gap. As you see, the equilibrium is on the right side of this curve, and where this supposed to be the potential output is realized, or it is indicated on the lower level of this economical representation. And on the graph we are showing here, there is another potential where it is located on the right side of the equilibrium, and this is supposed to be there is a deflationary gap where the long run aggregate supply and the potential GDP is located on the right side. and where the aggregate demand and the short-run aggregate supply curve intersect each other, and it is below the potential GDP, this has meant there is a deflationary gap in the economy. Then the potential GDP and actual GDP becomes important. The difference between the level of the real GDP and the potential GDP is known as the output gap. When the potential GDP or the output gap is positive or above the real GDP, or when GDP is higher than the potential, the economy is operating above its sustainable capacity and is likely to generate inflation. And when GDP falls short of the potential, the output gap is negative. Then here potential GDP and the actual GDP is represented with the Y star is the Y dash, which is represented on the right side, on the left side of the equation. Of course, on the left side where it is the Y is also left side, is the where it is there is a line above the Y which represent the Y star is the potential GDP. If you subtract this potential GDP from the actual GDP and divide it to the actual GDP, this will then gives you the equation of the factors relating changes in the unemployment to changes in output, which is the important, let's say, coefficient for estimating the differences between the actual unemployment rate and the natural rate of unemployment, which is represented with the U with the line above, or U star, as I mentioned in the below explanation. And from this knowledge, we need to know the Okun's law, which is also important, let's say, issue, and gives us some information about the unemployment and why it is unemployment important and affects the unemployment output. As you understand, the unemployment is one of the most important parameter, and it is very carefully treated. Unemployment, inflation, and output, these three parameters indicates the economy's or country's performance. When you look these three parameters quickly, you will get some information about the country's performance. Therefore, Okun's law is supposed to have some relationship between the unemployment and production, and it predicts that 1% increase in the unemployment will cause some 2% drop in the gross domestic production. Therefore, only 1% increase on the unemployment has negatively affects the economy, and GDP will double its double or two, I mean, the percentage as a percentage, double itself as a percentage, and 2% reduction on the GDP or output is expected or is realized. And Okun's law looks at the statistical relationship between the GDP and the output, or output and unemployment. And Okun's law can also be used to estimate gross national product. The Okun's law, as I mentioned, is important because it has the relationship between the unemployment and output, and as much as unemployment increase, the output will double itself, will create more problem to the economy. If 1% or 2%, let's say, unemployment realized, this has meant there will be a 4%. If it is 2%, there will be 4%. If it is 1%, there will be 2% of enlargement on the reduction on the GDP. Therefore, economists are studying the economy. There are two variables searching for determining countries' performance, as I mentioned to you, output and jobs, or so-called outputs and unemployment, or output and employment. And because there is a relationship between these two elements of an economy, and many economists study the relationship between the output, more specifically gross domestic production, and unemployment levels. Okun's law describes the statistical relationship between the unemployment and gross domestic product, and it holds that countries must grow its GDP by 2% in order to achieve 1% decrease in the unemployment. This is the vice versa. This is then the opposite cases. So you have to shift the output to percent for reducing the unemployment rate. Therefore, this is very important to know. Employment negatively affects output, or output decrease negatively affects unemployment. Then Observation is based on research by Arthur Okun, an economist and Yale professor in 1960s, suggested this, and still this is supposed to be very popular in the country's performance estimation regarding to the output and unemployment presentations or relations. When we are looking to the Phillips curve, which is related to the price changes, as you are understanding, price changes heavily affecting and changing the economy. Therefore, from the Phillips curve, it is derived the aggregate supply as it is given here. The price, the current price is supposed to be is equal to expected price plus 1 over alpha, supposed to be the coefficient of the output and potential, where the actual output and potential output differentiation or differences is estimated. Or when we are going to add to the exogenous supply shock to this equation, then we will have this V at the end of this equation. Then when we adding this supply shock to this equation, we will then easily determine how this supply shock affects and change the, because as I mentioned to you, output is very important for the estimation of the unemployment, and output also important parameter for estimating the performance of the economy. And when we are understanding the price changes is also important for the output because of the inflation. And as much as inflation is related to the unemployment from the Phillips curve, then we are combining this all together for determining how it is affecting and changing the whole economy. Therefore, when we are looking to the third equation, we subtract the last year price levels from the both sides for little bit eliminating the differentiation for getting the inflation rate, because the differentiation of the prices will gives us the inflation. Then we did this differentiation on the third equation, and we reached to the inflation. And inflation is supposed to be, as I mentioned in the former slides, is supposed to be expected inflation plus 1 over alpha differentiation of the actual and potential output differentiation plus the supply shock. And when we reach to the last equation, recalls the Okun's law, which states that the deviation of the output from its natural rate inversely related to the deviation of the unemployment from its natural rate. As you remember from the beginning of our class, I have mentioned this equation where the inflation is equal to the expected inflation minus beta differentiation of the output and the natural rate of the unemployment is then the gives us the output rate. So sorry, unemployment rate will be then added to the supply shock. This equation then will gives us the inflation regarding to the or represented with the unemployment, or with the let's say parameters with the variables which is included in this equation will then parameters which inflation, and as you know, Phillips curve related to the inflation and the unemployment, and this curve shows us how it is summarized and come to the conclusion and represents the inflation with the parameters of the unemployment. Building the Phillips curve, so the Phillips curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve essentially represent the same economic ideas. The adaptive expectations and inflation inertia, the Phillips curve shows the trade-off facing policymakers in terms of unemployment and inflation. To make the Phillips curve more useful, we need to state what causes expected inflation. As it is represented here, the simple, plausible assumption might be that people from expectations about future inflation based on recent inflation. As it is indicated here, the expected inflation is supposed to be the former inflation is equalized. And this is then the rewrite the equation again. Then the inflation is supposed to be the first term or the former term of the Phillips curve implies that the inflation has inertia and the inflation keeps going unless something acts to stop it. In essential, we have inflation because we expect it, and we expect it because we have it, which states the inflation depends on past inflation, cyclically unemployment, and these supply shocks. As it is represented here, the inflation is supposed to be is the former inflation minus beta and the differentiation of the unemployment minus unemployment, so-called the natural rate of unemployment, differentiation plus supply shock. The inertia in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, when it is given here, as you are understanding, it will then shifts the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve to the upward position. As you are observing, aggregate supply goes to the backward and aggregate demand curve is going upward. Therefore, most often the upward shifting aggregate demand curve is causing by persistent growth in the money supply, and aggregate supply shifts up because of expected inflation. And inertia in aggregate demand and aggregate supply, suppose the central bank is pursuing an expansionary money policy, buying some bonds, let's say, because expansionary money policy is usually has meant buying some bond for enlarging and pump up the money to the system. Therefore, this is, as it is represented here, it is shown that if the price have been rising quickly, people will expect them to continue to do so because aggregate supply demand depends on expected inflation, and the aggregate supply curve will continue to shift upward. It will continue to shift upward until some event such as recession or supply shock changes inflation and thereby changing expected inflation. As it is represented on the below equation, prices expected price plus 1 over alpha is the let's say real output or actual output minus potential output. As it is represented here, this is then showing that this is then the cause of recession, and high unemployment would reduce inflation, expected inflation, causing inflation inertia to subside. As it is represented here, the aggregate supply shifted back and aggregate demand either back or either upward can be realized regarding to these expansionary or contractionary money policy decisions or applications. Two causes of rising and falling inflation, as it is represented here. Again, the inflation, so-called, is or represented with the P and is equal to P minus 1, which is the former year or former period of time inflation, minus beta of this slope. Beta is the slope of this curve, is the unemployment rate minus natural rate of unemployment, which is the differentiation of this unemployment plus supply shock. The third term shows that inflation also rises and falls with supply shocks, and adverse supply shock will push production price up, and this type of inflation is called cost push inflation. And the second term shows, as it is indicated here, the unemployment, the cyclical unemployment exerts upward or downward pressure on inflation, as I mentioned to you regarding to these changes on the unemployment. If the unemployment is reduced, it is supposed the inflation is shifted up, and if the unemployment rate is enlarged, it is supposed then inflation go down. Therefore, low unemployment pulls inflation up, and this is called demand pull inflation because high aggregate demand is the causes. The short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment, while expected inflation and supply shocks are beyond the policymakers' control, in the short run, the policymakers can use monetary or fiscal policy to shift the aggregate demand curve, thus affecting output, unemployment, and inflation. A plot of the Phillips curve shows the short-run trade-off between the inflation and unemployment. As I mentioned to you, as much as supply shock and the inflation is downward, it is reducing and enlarging the unemployment rate. Here it is then the beta shows the slope of this curve, and policymakers who controls aggregate demand can choose a combination of inflation and unemployment on this short-run Phillips curve for determining their policies. And short-run trade-off between the inflation and unemployment, once again, as it is indicated here, it is shifted upward because the Phillips, because people's adjust their expectations of inflation over time. As much as the inflation is supposed to be shifted up, this will then shift the Phillips curve to the upward. And in the long run, the expectations adopted inflation returns to whatever rate the policymaker has chosen and unemployment returns to the natural rate, as it is indicated, it will become, of course, in the long run, ineffective. An increase in the expected inflation caused the curve to upward. As I mentioned, there is a positive affection when this price is going up and reduce the unemployment rate, or vice versa, so that then any unemployment rate, there will be a higher inflation. This means as much as the inflation in the short run goes up, unemployment rate will become smaller, as much as the minimum wage is reasonable and given sufficiently to the employee. As a conclusion, in this section, we discussed the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve demonstrates the inflation and unemployment trade-off the policymakers faces, and I have given you the equations of the inflation, the equations of the unemployment, the equation of the expected and potential GDP, also called the output, and we put into the equations and show you how it is affecting and changing inflation and the unemployment, vice versa, because inflation is in the equation. As you see, there is unemployment and unemployment rate, natural rate of unemployment differentiation is heavily affecting and changing the inflation. Therefore, in this chapter, we offer you this effects or affection on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve, and the aggregate expenditure and the potential and actual GDP's positions, how it is affecting and changing the economy is introduced to you. I stop here. I have already done my presentation. If you have any question, please ask me. If you don't have, then I will stop here, Taptik, and hope to see you next week again.
Okay, hocam, thank you very much. See you next week. Have a good day.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Hocam.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.
Bye.